The Indiana Fever had a choice. Their franchise player, the woman who sold out every arena she walked into, the woman whose jersey was flying off shelves faster than any player in league history, had just been publicly humiliated on a global stage. The entire sports world was watching. Sponsors were watching. Millions of new fans who had only discovered women's basketball because of her were watching. And when the moment came for the Fever to stand up and fight for her, they went quiet. Completely, strategically, deliberately quiet. That calculated, cold-blooded silence is the brutal decision rocking the WNBA right now. And once you understand exactly what it signals and why it happened, you will not be able to look at this league the same way again. What you are about to dig into isn't just a story about one front office making the wrong call at the wrong moment. This is the story of a league at war with itself, a full-scale institutional conflict between the unstoppable financial force that is Caitlin Clark and the deeply entrenched establishment culture that is trying with everything it has to contain her. The Indiana Fever's silence was the clearest, most official signal yet that even Clark's own organization has decided that maintaining comfortable relationships within the league's existing power structure is worth more than publicly defending the player who is single-handedly rebuilding their entire franchise from the ground up. We have been tracking every layer of this story, and today we are pulling it all into focus. If you have been following this saga as closely as we have, and based on your comments, a lot of you have been all over this for months, hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm this investigation matters, and it is what keeps us going deeper into the stories that the mainstream media won't touch with a 10-foot pole. Let's establish what we are actually dealing with here, because the scale of what Caitlin Clark represents economically to this league is something that gets glossed over constantly in favor of the drama. When she was selected first overall in the 2024 WNBA draft, the financial and cultural tremors were immediate and verifiable. Her college career at Iowa had already produced television ratings that left network executives doing double takes. Regular season games in the NCAA were pulling audiences that outperformed the Stanley Cup Finals and Major League Baseball playoff matchups. That is not a metaphor or a media talking point. Those are documented viewership numbers that shocked an industry. When she arrived in the WNBA, the Caitlin Clark effect was not a theoretical projection. It was a measurable, real-time economic event that the league had never experienced before. Arenas that had spent years playing in front of crowds ranging from half-full to genuinely sparse were suddenly selling out in minutes. Not selling well, selling out. Teams on Clark's away schedule were reporting their highest single-game attendance figures in franchise history. Cities that were not even on the Fever's road trip itinerary were lobbying league officials for neutral site games just to access the economic windfall her presence generates. The Indiana Fever, a franchise that had been one of the WNBA's most anonymous and financially fragile organizations, was suddenly the most watched team in the sport. Ticket prices on the secondary market reached levels the league had genuinely never seen. Major corporate sponsors who had shown minimal interest in the WNBA were suddenly calling. Television partners were renegotiating their enthusiasm for what a league with Clark in it was actually worth. The national media rights deal that had hovered around $60 million annually for years was now being projected to escalate toward $240 million, a quadrupling of value that analysts, broadcast executives, and team owners were all attributing to the same singular factor. The entire financial landscape of women's professional basketball was being transformed in real time. But what should have been an unambiguous celebration, a golden era arriving with fireworks, turned into something far more complicated from the very first day of her professional career. The physicality Clark encountered was not simply the expected intensity adjustment from college to professional competition. It was different. Veterans were not just competing hard against her. They were sending messages, deliberate messages delivered with contact away from the ball, with timing that served no strategic basketball purpose other than to communicate that her arrival was not welcome. The pattern was visible enough early in the season that fans and analysts were already talking about it publicly, before the moment that made it impossible to ignore any longer. That moment came during a game against the Chicago Sky. Kennedy Carter delivered a blindside shoulder check, a full-bodied collision delivered with momentum and intent, occurring well away from the basketball in a moment where the play had already moved elsewhere. Clark went down hard. The footage spread across every platform in hours. By the following morning, it was the most discussed moment in the recent history of women's basketball, and it generated a reaction across sports media that went far beyond the usual WNBA conversation. Athletes from other sports weighed in, celebrities posted. The clip was being shown on general sports networks that rarely covered WNBA games at all. The league's initial classification of the contact as a common foul was, and there is no diplomatic way to frame this, a statement. Not about the severity of what happened on the floor, but about whose interests were being prioritized in the aftermath. The ruling was eventually upgraded to a flagrant foul, but only after a public pressure campaign so overwhelming that the league had no viable alternative but to act. The delay itself communicated everything. The establishment's first instinct was to minimize, to normalize, to treat an obvious targeting incident as routine contact and move on. That instinct revealed where the sympathies inside the league's decision-making structure actually resided. Carter's refusal to address the incident in any meaningful way afterward only amplified the story. The visible reaction from her teammates on the sideline, captured clearly on broadcast cameras, transformed what might otherwise have been processed as a single ugly play into a symbol of something much larger. For millions of fans watching, this was no longer a conversation about basketball. It was a conversation about whether the WNBA's established culture was willing to protect the player who was doing more for this league's future than anyone else in it. Then the film study intensified. Analysts, fans, and former players started reviewing game tape with a different question in mind, and what they found was a pattern that did not resolve itself through conventional basketball explanations. On repeated possessions, Clark would be standing open on the perimeter, hands up, calling for the ball, in position to take a high-percentage shot that, given her shooting profile, represents a near-automatic scoring opportunity. Instead, passes were forced into contested situations in the paint. Drive opportunities were created in isolation instead of flowing through the player who represented the highest expected value option on the floor. This happened too consistently across too many games to be written off as individual bad decisions in the flow of play. Social media connected the dots at extraordinary speed. Across Reddit, YouTube breakdowns, and X discussions, fans who had been quietly watching the film were now building detailed cases. Veteran star Aaliyah Boston gave post-game interviews that were notably measured, responses careful enough to avoid saying anything inflammatory while simultaneously carrying an undercurrent of unspoken frustration. When pressed directly about the visible disconnect in the team's offensive flow, her answers stayed firmly inside corporate language, the kind of language you use when you want to avoid saying what you actually think out loud. For a fan base that was already primed to look for evidence of an internal problem, those carefully managed responses were fuel on a fire that was already burning very hot. The narrative was no longer just about physical play from opponents. The possibility, uncomfortable, unsettling, and increasingly supported by circumstantial evidence, was that Clark was facing resistance not just from outside the Fever's locker room, but from within it. And that was the context in which the league's most powerful institutions were preparing to deliver the most official, most undeniable message of all. Before we get into the decision that changed everything, the front office moment that has fans more furious than any physical foul, we need to talk about the institutional media layer that was working in parallel to all of this. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Do you think the Indiana Fever's silence was a strategic calculation they made deliberately, or do you think they simply didn't have the spine to act? The distinction matters more than you might think. And your perspective is exactly the kind of analysis this channel exists to surface. The resistance to Caitlin Clark wasn't being expressed only through hard fouls and contested plays. It was being amplified at the level of the sport's most respected public voices. WNBA legend Diana Taurasi, one of the all-time greats of this game, someone whose opinions carry institutional weight inside the basketball world, had delivered a statement before Clark even played her first professional game. The words were plain and cold. Reality, Taurasi said, is coming for her. In a different context, read in isolation, that reads like a seasoned veteran simply acknowledging the difficulty of the transition from college stardom to professional competition. But read in the full context of everything that followed, the physical targeting, the alleged locker room dynamics, the institutional decisions. It reads very differently. It reads like a warning issued from the establishment, delivered with the authority of an all-time great's name attached to it, signaling to the league's power structure that the old guard had already reached its verdict on what kind of welcome this rookie deserved. This is important because it illustrates something fans were slower than they should have been to fully recognize. The resistance Clark was facing was not confined to individual players on opposing teams making hard basketball decisions. It was cultural, institutional, and being actively voiced by the figures the sport had always used to define who belonged and who didn't. The implicit argument, the one nobody at that level was willing to make explicitly, was that she hadn't paid the dues the veterans had paid. She hadn't endured the years of sparse crowds, the underpaid contracts, the lack of mainstream media attention, the total absence of the cultural recognition that generations of WNBA players had worked for without receiving. And whatever the emotional legitimacy of that frustration as a personal feeling, it was beginning to express itself through decisions with concrete consequences for the league's most commercially valuable asset. Then the United States Olympic Selection Committee announced the roster for the Paris Games. Caitlin Clark's name was not on it. The committee cited a combination of senior national team experience and team chemistry as the basis for the roster decisions made. The sports world did not accept those explanations, and the closer anyone looked at the actual roster construction, the more those explanations collapsed under basic scrutiny. Several players who earned Olympic selection had less relevant recent performance data and thinner cases based on the metrics that roster committees are supposed to use. The arguments about chemistry and experience, applied consistently and transparently, would not have produced the roster that was announced. What the decision produced instead was the single most high-profile act of institutional gatekeeping the sport had ever generated. A formal signal from the bodies that control access to the sport's most prestigious platform, telling the most commercially transformative player in the league's history that her fame, her fan base, her jersey sales, and her television ratings did not grant her entry into the inner circle. This was the established culture asserting itself at the highest possible level. And the backlash was swift, global, and came from voices well outside the traditional WNBA conversation, general sports media, celebrities, athletes from other sports, entertainment figures, all expressing the same disbelief. The self-defeating absurdity of the decision was visible to everyone looking from outside the sport's internal politics. Before we continue, if this channel has been your go-to source for what's actually happening inside the WNBA's power structure, becoming a channel member is the most direct way to make sure we can keep this going. Your support is what makes the deeper investigations possible. Which brings us to the moment that defines this entire story. The Indiana Fever front office, the organization whose entire commercial and competitive revival was built on the foundation of what Caitlin Clark generates, watched all of this unfold. They watched their franchise player become the center of a global controversy. They watched the sports world demand accountability from the institutions that had made this decision. They watched millions of fans, including the new fans Clark had brought to this sport for the first time, wait for someone inside the Fever organization to say something meaningful. And then the Fever said nothing meaningful at all. The statements that did emerge from the front office were the most carefully constructed, conflict-avoiding, politically calibrated language that corporate PR is capable of producing, phrases about bright futures. Language about focusing on the WNBA season, comments about believing in the organization's players. Not one word of genuine advocacy, not one sentence that pushed back against the committee's decision, questioned its basis, or communicated that the Fever viewed the Olympic snub as anything other than an unfortunate outcome to be managed quietly and moved past. If you have been sharing these investigations with people who are just now starting to follow this story, keep doing it. Share this video with someone who hasn't fully connected why the Fever's silence was not just a PR failure, but an actual declaration about where this organization's loyalties sit. The more this conversation expands, the harder it becomes for the league to continue operating as if none of this is being noticed. The financial reality sitting underneath that silence is breathtaking in its scale. Clark's rookie contract paid her $76,000. $76,000. A figure she almost certainly generates back for the league in a single advertising break during one of her nationally televised games. Meanwhile, the WNBA's national media rights deal, which had been valued at approximately $60 million annually through the previous agreement, was now being projected to reach $240 million. That is a 400% increase in broadcast value, occurring within a compressed window, and attributable by every serious media industry analysis to the transformative commercial impact of one player, changing the entire proposition of what this league is worth to television partners. The Fever knew this. Every owner in the league knew this. The executives who negotiated the new broadcast deals knew this. And yet, when the moment arrived to publicly stand with the player responsible for that transformation, the calculation went the other direction. The choice to maintain comfortable political positioning within the league's existing power structure was deemed worth more than advocating for a player whose economic contribution to the franchise was generating revenue that dwarfed anything the organization had experienced in its history. Consider the wider stakeholder picture. Clark's presence on the visiting roster was generating record attendance figures at away venues. Teams she was playing against were logging their best-attended home games in franchise history, specifically because Fever road trips were selling out arenas that had never sold out before. The league's commercial ecosystem was benefiting universally and directly from everything Clark generated. Sponsors who had never engaged seriously with WNBA inventory were now signing deals. The sport's visibility in general entertainment coverage had expanded in ways that took decades to build elsewhere, all of it traceable back to the same source. And the Fever chose silence anyway. This is the paradox that sits at the center of this entire war. The WNBA establishment, from the Olympic Selection Committee to individual franchise front offices, desperately wants the revenue, the mainstream relevance, and the cultural visibility that Clark generates. But it appears fundamentally unable or unwilling to fully accept the shift in power dynamics that inevitably accompanies her. The old guard, veterans who built this league across decades of difficult conditions, executives who navigated years of financial fragility and minimal media attention, are watching a 22-year-old reshape their life's work in a single season. The emotional complexity of that dynamic is real and deserves to be acknowledged. But allowing that emotional complexity to drive institutional decisions has consequences that extend well beyond any internal power struggle. Because the fans who followed Caitlin Clark into the WNBA are watching all of this. They are attentive in ways that the league's traditional core audience expresses differently. Their investment in the sport is newer, and it is directly tied to their investment in her. Every act of institutional hostility, every foul that takes 2 weeks and an internet firestorm to get upgraded, every roster decision that defies obvious logic, every front office that goes quiet when advocacy was required, registers with that audience. They have options. Their loyalty to the WNBA brand has not yet calcified into the kind of deep-rooted commitment that survives repeated disappointments, and the league's window for converting their attention into lasting fandom is not unlimited. The critical question that the WNBA's decision-makers have to confront is not whether Caitlin Clark has earned her place in this sport. History has answered that question with complete decisiveness. The question is whether the league's establishment is capable of recognizing that their own long-term financial security is inseparable from the commercial ecosystem she is building, and whether they can make that recognition operational before they squander the most extraordinary growth opportunity women's professional basketball has ever been handed. That is the question the new season will begin to answer. And we will be here breaking down every development the moment it happens. If you want to be in this conversation from the beginning when the next chapter breaks, the contract dynamics, the locker room evolution, the front office decisions that define what the Fever actually learned from all of this, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. We have a deep dive coming that reframes everything you think you know about the business decisions waiting for this franchise in the months ahead. You do not want to be the last one in the room when that drops.